Hi, everyone. Let's talk about composition today. We are going to talk about composition as well as follow up with an assignment that deals with composition with more of a focus on positive and negative space. So, what is composition? In visual art, composition refers to the arrangement or placements of elements on the page, the things that you draw, and where they are placed on the page, and what kind of an effect it has on the viewer. So, why should we pay attention to composition? Well, it's to help you create a more effective, engaging, and dynamic image. And you want to look for these following elements. We want to find unity, balance, some movement in the composition, rhythm, a focus to focus your eye on, some contrast, pattern, and proportion. All of these elements help to create a very good, engaging composition. We are specifically going to talk about these four rules of composition today: the rule of thirds, the rule of odds, dynamic movement, and then the balance of positive and negative space. So let's start with the rule of thirds. You can create a more visually interesting and dynamic image if you break up the page into thirds vertically as well as horizontally, and then placing elements within those areas. So here in this example, we have vertical thirds breaking up something like this smaller leaf, which is over here on the left third, and then this larger leaf that fills up the other 2/3 of the page. Horizontally, it also works as well because we have this leaf going up into the top third, and then these two leaves are down in the bottom third of this page. A few other examples I want us to look at is The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali. Notice how he's paid attention to breaking up his page into thirds. The Fighting Temeraire by J.M.W. Turner. Again, you don't have to necessarily focus just on vertical or horizontal thirds, but you can use both elements in your image. And then here's a scene from Kill Bill, which I felt like broke up the thirds so perfectly that I had to include it in this slideshow. So now let's talk about the rule of odds. So there's a tendency for odd numbers of things to be more interesting than even numbers of things, because even numbers convey balance and stability, while odd numbers create kind of a dynamic imbalance. So here as an example is Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth, and we have 3 places where our eyes rest. The Gleaners by Jean-Francois Millet. Again, 3 figures in the foreground. And then Elephant Fairies by Amy Cutler, and she has created groupings of 5 groupings of people and elephants to break up this page and create a more dynamic and interesting composition. And then, for some reason, I keep running into these movie references. The Magnificent Seven. It just wouldn't be the same if it was the Magnificent Six or the Magnificent Eight. So let's talk a little bit about dynamic movement. So there's a tendency for diagonal lines to create movement and depth, which encourages the viewer's eyes to move around the page, while vertical and horizontal lines are very stable and static. So here is an example where the leaves kind of come shooting out from the base of the page, creating sort of like this burst forward and out. Now, you don't necessarily have to have literal lines in your image to create dynamic lines. In this example, Saint Sebastian by Guido Reni, you can see that the way the body is turned, the way the head is turned, and the way the leg is turned as well creates visual lines. And the dynamics of this Wave Under the Wave off Kanagawa by Hokusai. So again, we have these high peaks and valleys, and even in the distance, Mount Fuji creates this dynamic peak. And here we have The Star or the Dancer on Stage by Edgar Degas, and we have a sort of a burst from the dancer right here on which that just creates sort of an explosion. And then, of course, I have to include a scene from a movie. This one is from The Shining, and we have a lot of dynamic diagonal lines. This is actually a really good example of one-point perspective, which is something we're going to talk about more later this semester. But one-point perspective does tend to create some very dramatic diagonals. So I do want to have you keep in mind that diagonal lines are for creating energy and movement, which tends to create a more interesting composition. But sometimes stable vertical and horizontal lines are the right choice for the image that you want to create. So if you're creating an image where there's a lot of movement, then you want the diagonal lines. But if you want to create an image that's really about stability and serenity, then you might want to stick with the horizontal and vertical lines. So let's move on and talk about the balance of positive and negative space. So positive space refers to the subject matter of the image, the actual image that is the main point of the drawing. The negative space is basically the background or just all the space around it. So if you find a balance between the two, it can really help to create a visually pleasing composition. So here's an example. If you see faces or if you see a vase in this image, if you're seeing the vase, then for you, the white area is the positive space and the black area becomes the background or the negative space. But if you're actually seeing two faces, then what you're seeing is the black area is the positive space and the white area is the background negative space. This is an interesting example of a use of columns. I thought it was kind of interesting because the columns themselves are the positive space. But if you look at the negative space in between the columns, this is where the figures appear. So it's basically as simple as the thing that you're drawing and the space that's around it. Not only just the space around it, but notice that the space in the interiors, these count as negative space as well. So that can actually create a lot of dynamic movement and interest in the image. I just wanted to show this example of the stools. This is going to be part of our project later on, but again, looking at the space as its own entity. So you're looking more at the negative space. The positive image really has no detail at all. It's really just an empty, flat space. So in this way, you can really get to see how much of a balance you're creating because you're not distracted by patterns and textures and light and value and lines, but you're really just looking at what the subject is and what the background is. And something that I would like for you to practice in this exercise is to draw the spaces. So this is something interesting that you want to try to train your eyes to do, is to see the spaces and put your effort into drawing those spaces, and the image of the object will appear. I thought this was a very interesting example because this person drew around each of these power lines. So the power lines, again, are the positive spaces, the subject matter, and they drew this around it to bring more emphasis onto the negative space and to be able to see, is there a balance in the positive and negative space in this composition? Here are some examples of a really good 50-50 balance, some studies of positive and negative space. Again, just flattened to its just basic form, just black and white, so that you're not distracted by any of those details. And in some of these cases, I think especially over here, you can see how some have been flipped, like from this corner to this corner. It's the same image, but the black and white have been flipped. Same with this large image down here. It's the same as this one right here. The black and white have been flipped. That's a good way to be able to tell, did I get the balance or not? So when you're paying attention to composition and balance, you want to remember to use the full sheet of paper, use the full page. So you want to avoid placing something right in the middle of the paper. I know when you're drawing something, you want to look at it and draw it, and you think of that as the subject. But what you end up with is all this white area around the outside, and you end up with just a very static, still image that really has not a whole lot of visual interest. But if you fill up the whole page and pay attention to these interesting shapes, even the positive and negative shapes, and breaking up these edges as well, that kind of brings it to life and makes it a much more interesting image. So the next time we meet in class, we're going to be doing some drawings of skeletons, and I just wanted to show you a few examples. So I want you to notice that we are looking at contour line drawings. We're not going into value just yet. We're just focusing on lines still for another week. So think about how you can use your contour lines that you've been working with so far and incorporate it with composition to create a really nice image. This is an example of someone who has used value, but try to avoid using value in your drawing and pay most attention to how the image fills up the page, the dynamics of the positive and negative space, and maybe how the lines are moving, some diagonal lines, some vertical lines, and the use of thirds. This one I think has really especially good negative spaces along all sides of the page. So remember, right now, we are not doing anything with value just yet. We're going to move into that later on this semester, but we're still working just with lines. Now, for your composition study assignment, what I would like for you to do is to use the stools that I've set up in Fletcher Drawing Studio. I want you to make 6 thumbnail drawings, then choose one of them to create a positive negative space composition study. I want you to use a viewfinder to find the different compositions, and I'd like for you to make this drawing with graphite on large 18 by 24 drawing paper, not on newsprint. So the finished assignment should look kind of like this. Take a large sheet of paper, put your 6 thumbnails along one side and the one composition study on the other. Notice that I have 3 vertical thumbnails and 3 horizontal thumbnails. The vertical ones are called portrait orientation, and the horizontal ones are called landscape orientation. So wait a minute, what are thumbnail drawings? These are basically small, quick studies, kind of like gesture drawings that capture the essential components of the composition. So what you're doing to make these is to pin down the composition before you start working on the larger drawing. So they should really only take a minute or two. Keep it really sketchy and gestural. You're basically just working out what that composition looks like on the page before you tackle the larger drawing. It's a really good way to figure out what you like the most before you put a lot of time and effort into a larger drawing. It's easy to see these compositions on a smaller scale like this. So for the thumbnails, what you can do is trace the interior opening of a viewfinder. This is a viewfinder right here, and the size of the thumbnail can just be the size of that interior of the viewfinder. So you can see I've already put a few on the page here. For your composition study, for the bigger, larger drawing, you can just trace around the outside of a viewfinder. All of these proportions are the same in these viewfinders and on your 18 by 24 paper. So hold on a minute, what's a viewfinder? This is a tool that you can use to kind of block out everything that's not going to be in the drawing. So it can be cut from cardboard or paper, and sometimes you can just use your hands. If you see anybody kind of looking at things like this or like this, that's basically what they're doing. They're creating a viewfinder with their hands. So the viewfinders in Fletcher Studio are cut to the same proportions as your 18 by 24 drawing paper. So what you see in this opening here should match exactly what goes on in the paper. So what you're looking at right here is basically what you're going to draw. So let me give you some tips about how to use a viewfinder like this effectively. First, you want to hold it at arm's length with your arm straight out. This way it's always in the same place when you look back and forth at your drawing paper and the viewfinder. If you're holding it like this, it's really easy to move it in and out of view, and then what you're actually seeing in the viewfinder will change, which means your drawing is going to change. Sometimes it helps to close one eye. You know, we have these 2 eyes and it kind of shifts things around when we're looking at them just because the way they're placed on our face. We're going to talk about that even more when we talk about perspective. So if you close one eye, then everything kind of stays in place in the viewfinder. Look carefully at the edges of that viewfinder window. Where the object falls out of view, it should fall on the paper at the same spot. So I've shown this with these red arrows. So you'll notice that the leg of this stool kind of falls off the viewfinder almost halfway in the middle of that frame. So that's where the leg is going to be drawn on your paper. This one also is right about halfway in the middle of the frame across the bottom. So that's where that leg is going to fall on the paper. And then this is going to be kind of in between, about a quarter of the distance. So that's where that leg is going to be drawn. So in this way, you can kind of find proportions by how things are fitting just right on your paper. So when you're making the thumbnails, what I want you to do is walk around the stools to get different perspectives. You can see how the 2 stools that I've placed there can look different depending on where you're looking at them. I want you to, again, make 3 vertical or portrait layout thumbnails and 3 horizontal or landscape thumbnails. So here I've shown the landscape versions. These are sort of like horizontal, and then the slide that we just looked at is what it would look like vertically. I want you to notice that you don't necessarily have to put the whole setup in your frame. You can zoom in into very specific areas to find even more interesting compositions on just parts of on the legs. You definitely don't have to have the whole setup within the frame. You don't even have to have a whole stool in your frame. And one last tip, sometimes it helps to clip the viewfinder to your masonite board. Just grab another bulldog clip and clip it to the edge while you're drawing. That helps to not have to hold it steady with your hands, and it always stays in the same place while you're drawing. You would just have to move the board around the room as you go, and you'll just look through the viewfinder as you move around the room. So once you've made those 6 thumbnail drawings, walking around the room, looking through the viewfinder, you're going to choose the one that you think shows the best example of having a good composition and a nice even balance of positive and negative space. What I want you to do is enlarge this to make that larger composition study. The study should only show the positive and negative space without any of those details of the stools themselves. No textures, no patterns, no shading, just the light and the dark. I want you to focus on seeing that negative space. So what I've done here is made a little video showing you how to make that composition study drawing. And I just wanted to point out at the bottom here, it doesn't show in the video, but I did use a graphite stick to fill in some of the large areas. So let's watch this video together. All right, so I hope that clarifies what I mean by creating a composition study from one of those 6 thumbnail drawings. So where are those viewfinders? There's a drawer on the opposite side of the sink in that large storage table, and it's underneath a tray of charcoal all the way on the right side. If you open it up, you'll just see it's full of these cardboard viewfinders. Help yourself to those. And then I have one last note about the rules of composition. Rules are meant to be broken. I really think of these more as suggestions. I don't really think we need to follow all of the rules, but take these suggestions as ways to create dynamic and engaging art. But just use the ones you need and leave the rest. We're going to be practicing them in this class, but I love this quote by Robert Bringhurst, who says, by all means, break the rules, break them beautifully, deliberately, and well. So that's it for this composition slideshow. I will see you later this week in class.